Suddenly, my son became very concerned and brewed a natural herbal remedy for me because my blood pressure was sky high. I gave the cup to his wife, who was complaining of stress. 1 hour later, she clutched her throat in panic and, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Courtney, and I never thought that a simple cup of tea could reveal the darkness hiding in my own son's heart." At 60 years old, I believed I had seen enough of life's cruelties. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered that autumn afternoon when Henry brought me what he called his special herbal blend. It was a Tuesday in October when Henry knocked on my door, something that hadn't happened in months. Since his father died 19 years ago, our relationship had grown distant, reduced to obligatory holiday calls and the occasional awkward dinner. So when I opened the door to find him standing there with Avery, his wife of 9 years, both wearing unusually bright smiles, my first instinct was suspicion. "Mom, you look tired," Henry said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes scanned my living room with an intensity I didn't recognize. "Have you been taking care of yourself?" The question struck me as odd. Henry was 37 years old, a man who had barely shown concern for my well-being since his teenage years. After his father's death, he had blamed me for not preventing the accident, as if I could have stopped a drunk driver from running a red light. The guilt I carried was already overwhelming without my own son's accusations. "I'm fine, Henry," I replied, closing the door behind them. "What brings you both here?" Avery shifted uncomfortably beside him, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. She avoided making eye contact with me, instead focusing on the family photos lining my mantelpiece. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. "We've been talking," Henry continued, settling himself on my velvet green sofa as if he owned the place. "Avery and I think you need more support. You're not getting any younger and living alone in this big house. Well, it's not safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. Just 2 months ago, I had received a call that changed everything. My brother Robert, the only family member who had ever truly understood me, had died suddenly of a heart attack. He left me his entire estate, including a beautiful property at Lake Tahoe and $350,000 in savings. It was a generous inheritance that provided security I had never known, but it also seemed to have awakened an interest in my welfare that had been dormant for years. "I manage perfectly well," I said, moving to the kitchen to put some distance between us. The familiar ritual of making coffee usually calmed my nerves, but today my hands shook as I measured the grounds. Henry followed me, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Mom. Look at you. You're clearly stressed. Your blood pressure must be through the roof." He was right about the stress, though not for the reasons he imagined. Since Robert's death, I had been struggling with grief and the sudden weight of financial decisions I had never needed to make. Robert had always been my confidant, the one person who called just to check how I was feeling. His absence left a void that felt impossible to fill. "I brought something that might help," Henry said, reaching into a canvas bag I hadn't noticed before. He pulled out a small mason jar filled with what looked like dried leaves and stems. "I've been studying herbal remedies lately. This is a special blend that's supposed to be excellent for circulation and calming the nerves." I stared at the jar, my mind racing. Henry had never shown any interest in natural medicine or healing arts. In fact, he had always mocked my own fascination with herbal teas and home remedies, calling them hippie nonsense whenever I tried to suggest alternatives to conventional medicine. "Where did you learn about this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Online research," he replied quickly, too quickly. "There are amazing resources now about traditional healing methods. This particular combination has been used for centuries to help with stress and blood pressure issues." As he spoke, I noticed Avery standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing between Henry and me as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. When our eyes met, she looked away immediately. "Let me brew some for you right now," Henry continued, already moving toward my stove. "You'll feel so much better, I promise." The urgency in his voice unsettled me. This wasn't the casual suggestion of a caring son. It was something else entirely. I watched as he filled my kettle with water, his movements precise and practiced, as if he had done this before. "Henry, I appreciate the thought, but I already had coffee and—" "Mom, please." He turned to face me, his expression suddenly serious. "I know we haven't been as close as we should be since Dad died. I know I've been a disappointment as a son, but I want to change that. I want to take better care of you." The words hit me unexpectedly. I had longed for years to hear my son acknowledge our fractured relationship, to show some desire to rebuild what we had lost. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe this was genuinely his attempt to reconnect. "Avery's been encouraging me to reach out more," he added, glancing toward his wife. "Haven't you, honey?" Avery nodded stiffly, but something in her expression made me pause. She looked almost frightened. Her hands continued to tremble, and a thin sheen of sweat had appeared on her forehead despite the cool October air flowing through my kitchen window. The kettle began to whistle, and Henry moved quickly to remove it from the heat. He measured the herbal mixture into my favorite blue porcelain teacup, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. Watching him handle something so precious to me felt wrong somehow, as if he were defiling a sacred object. "This needs to steep for exactly 7 minutes," he said, pouring the hot water over the herbs. The liquid immediately turned a muddy brown color, and an unfamiliar bitter scent filled the air. The timing is crucial for maximum effectiveness. 7 minutes. Such a specific requirement for someone who claimed to have learned about herbal remedies through casual online research. I found myself studying his face, looking for any sign of deception, but Henry had always been good at hiding his true thoughts. "I don't know," I said slowly. "The smell is quite strong. Maybe I should start with something milder." "Nonsense," Henry replied, stirring the mixture with one of my silver spoons. "Strong medicine requires strong ingredients. Trust me, Mom." "Have I ever steered you wrong?" The irony of the question wasn't lost on me. Henry had made countless decisions throughout his adult life that had caused pain and disappointment. His sudden concern for my health felt manufactured, rehearsed even. Avery suddenly spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe Courtney would prefer regular tea today, Henry. This does smell quite intense." Henry's head snapped toward his wife, and for just a moment I saw something flash in his eyes that made my blood run cold. It was anger, pure and sharp, quickly masked by his practiced smile. "Avery's been dealing with some stress lately, too," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "Work has been overwhelming for her. Maybe she could benefit from this as well." I looked at Avery more closely. She did appear stressed, but not in the way Henry suggested. This wasn't the exhaustion of a busy teacher dealing with difficult students. This was the tension of someone carrying a terrible secret. "Oh, I couldn't," Avery said quickly. "I'm sure Courtney needs it more than I do." "Nonsense," I heard myself saying, though I wasn't sure why. "If you're both concerned about stress, there's certainly enough for 2 cups. I reached for another teacup, one of the matching blue porcelain set, and began to pour half of the steaming liquid from my cup into hers. Henry moved as if to stop me, then caught himself. "Actually, Mom, the dosage is calibrated for 1 person, he said. "If you split it, neither of you will get the full benefit." "Then let Avery have it," I replied, handing her the cup. "I can try it another time when you bring more." Avery's hands shook violently as she accepted the cup, and I noticed tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice carried no gratitude. Henry watched his wife with an expression I couldn't read. There was anticipation there, and something else that looked disturbingly like scientific curiosity. "Go ahead, honey," he encouraged. "It should still be warm enough." Avery lifted the cup to her lips, hesitated for just a moment, then took a small sip. Almost immediately, her face contorted with disgust. "It's extremely bitter," she said, setting the cup down quickly. "Effective medicine often is," Henry replied. "Try a larger sip. You need enough to make a difference." I watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about the way Henry was watching his wife, the intensity of his focus on her reaction, felt predatory. Avery took another sip, larger this time, and swallowed with visible effort. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her eyes widened with what looked like panic. "I feel," she began, then stopped, pressing her hand to her throat. "What is it?" I asked, moving toward her. "My throat," she gasped. "It feels tight, and my stomach." She doubled over slightly, her free hand clutching her abdomen. Henry jumped up from his chair, but instead of rushing to help his wife, he moved to the sink and began washing the jar that had contained the herbs. "It's probably just the strong taste," he said without turning around. "Some people have sensitive palates." Avery's breathing became labored, and beads of sweat broke out across her forehead. "Henry?" she called out, her voice strained. "Something's wrong." That's when I saw it, the look that passed across my son's face when he finally turned to acknowledge his wife's distress. It wasn't concern or surprise. It was calculation. The teacup slipped from Avery's trembling fingers and shattered against my kitchen floor, sending fragments of blue porcelain and brown liquid across the white tiles. She collapsed into the nearest chair, clutching her throat and fighting for each breath. And in that moment, as I watched my son's wife struggle with symptoms that came on far too quickly and severely to be coincidental, I realized that the herbal tea hadn't been intended for her at all. It had been meant for me. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually lifted my spirits, but I woke with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. I couldn't stop replaying the events of the previous afternoon. The image of Avery clutching her throat burned into my memory like a warning I was only beginning to understand. Henry had rushed his wife to urgent care, claiming she must have had an allergic reaction to something she'd eaten earlier. He had been almost theatrical in his concern, holding her arm as she stumbled to their car, calling out reassurances about getting her medical attention immediately. But I had seen the way he hesitated before helping her. Those precious seconds where he watched her suffer with what looked disturbingly like scientific interest. I made my morning coffee in a different cup, unable to bear the thought of using any of my blue porcelain set. The sight of those broken pieces scattered across my kitchen floor had felt like an omen. As I swept them up the night before, I noticed that several fragments still held traces of that bitter brown liquid, and the smell that rose from them made my stomach turn. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Henry's name appeared on the caller ID, and I hesitated before answering. Part of me wasn't ready to hear whatever explanation he had prepared overnight. "Mom, I wanted to update you about Avery." His voice came through clearly, carrying just the right note of concerned husband. "The doctor said she had a severe allergic reaction. Her throat was quite swollen, and her digestive system was inflamed." "Allergic to what?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "They're not entirely sure. Could have been something she ate for lunch, or maybe one of the herbs in that tea blend. You know how sensitive some people can be to natural remedies." The way he said it, so casually dismissive, made my skin crawl. "Is she feeling better now?" "Much better, thank you for asking. They gave her some medication to reduce the inflammation, and she's resting at home today." "But Mom, this got me thinking about how important it is to be careful with herbal treatments. Maybe we should stick to more conventional approaches for your health concerns." I almost laughed at the irony. Yesterday he had been so enthusiastic about his special blend, and now he was suggesting we abandon herbal remedies altogether? "That's probably wise," I agreed, curious to see where this conversation was heading. "Actually, I was wondering if I could come by later today. I left my reading glasses on your coffee table, and I'd like to check on you after yesterday's excitement." I hadn't noticed any reading glasses, but I agreed to the visit. After hanging up, I walked through my house more carefully than I had in years, looking for anything that seemed out of place or unfamiliar. In my kitchen, I examined every jar and container, making sure nothing had been added or removed without my knowledge. It was then that I noticed something odd about my spice cabinet. The dried herbs I kept for cooking were arranged differently than I remembered. Small details, but after 40 years of maintaining the same household routines, these differences stood out. My oregano jar was in front of the basil instead of behind it. The cinnamon sticks were on the wrong shelf entirely. Someone had been going through my herbs, and I was fairly certain it hadn't been Avery. When Henry arrived that afternoon, he came bearing gifts, a bouquet of grocery store flowers, and a small paper bag from the health food store downtown. "I felt terrible about yesterday," he said, handing me the flowers with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I brought you some chamomile tea instead. Much milder and safer for someone with your blood pressure concerns." I accepted the flowers but eyed the paper bag with suspicion. "How do you know about my blood pressure?" Henry paused in the middle of removing his jacket. "You mentioned it yesterday, remember? You said you've been feeling stressed since Uncle Robert died." I hadn't mentioned my blood pressure at all, but I decided not to correct him. Instead, I invited him to sit down and made us both coffee with my regular, familiar grounds. As I prepared the drinks, I watched him in my peripheral vision. He was studying my living room with the same intensity as the day before, his gaze lingering on particular items with an expression I was beginning to recognize as acquisitive. "You know, Mom, this house is really too big for one person," he said, settling into my late husband's favorite armchair. "Have you thought about downsizing? Maybe moving into one of those nice senior living communities?" The suggestion hit me like cold water. "I'm 60 years old, Henry, not 90, and I love this house. Your father and I built our entire life here." Of course," he said quickly, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I just worry about you rattling around in all this space, and the maintenance costs must be enormous." Actually, thanks to Robert's inheritance, money was no longer a concern for me. The $350,000 he had left me, combined with the valuable Lake Tahoe property, meant I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without worrying about expenses. But something told me that sharing this information with Henry would be unwise. "I managed just fine," I replied, handing him his coffee. "I'm sure you do. But still, if you ever decide to sell, the real estate market is very strong right now. A house like this in this neighborhood could easily bring in $400,000, maybe more. $400,000. I watched my son's face as he said it, noting the way his eyes lit up slightly when discussing the potential value of my home. Combined with Robert's inheritance, I represented over $750,000 in potential wealth. The realization made my hands tremble slightly as I lifted my coffee cup. "Have you given any thought to updating your will?" Henry continued, his tone carefully casual. "I know it's not a pleasant subject, but Dad's been gone for almost 20 years now. Your circumstances have changed significantly." There it was. The real reason for these sudden visits, the manufactured concern about my health, the interest in my living situation. Henry wasn't worried about my well-being. He was worried about his inheritance. "What makes you think I haven't updated it already?" I asked. Henry's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. "Have you? That's not really something I need to discuss with you right now, is it?" The silence that followed felt charged with tension. Henry set down his cup and leaned forward slightly, his salesman's instincts clearly taking over. "Mom, I hope you know that I'm not asking out of greed or self-interest. It's just that estate planning is so important, especially when there are significant assets involved. You don't want the government taking a huge chunk in taxes, and you don't want to leave Avery and me scrambling to figure out your wishes if something unexpected happens." "Something unexpected?" "Well, at your age, health issues can arise suddenly, That's why yesterday scared me so much when you looked so tired and stressed. Heart disease, strokes, even accidents, they become much more common after 60. The way he said it, with such clinical detachment, sent a chill through me. It almost sounded like a threat disguised as concern. I'm perfectly healthy, Henry. My last physical showed no signs of heart disease. My cholesterol is normal, and my blood pressure is only slightly elevated due to the stress of losing my brother. Still, Henry persisted, it would give me such peace of mind to know that your affairs are in order. And if there's anything I can do to help with the paperwork or legal aspects. I stood up abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. I think I can handle my own legal affairs, thank you. Henry remained seated, but I could feel his eyes following me as I moved around the room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. When I turned back toward him, I caught him staring at my left hand with unusual focus. My mother's diamond ring, which I wore daily, seemed to hold particular fascination for him. That's a beautiful ring, he said. I remember Dad mentioning that it was quite valuable. It was my mother's engagement ring. She wanted me to have it. And will you pass it on to Avery someday? I know she's always admired it. The presumption in his question took my breath away. I haven't really thought about it. Well, when the time comes, I hope you'll consider keeping it in the family. It would mean a lot to have that connection to grandmother. Family. The word felt hollow coming from him, considering that he had barely spoken to me in months before Robert's death made me suddenly worth cultivating. Henry finished his coffee and stood to leave, but not before walking through my house one more time, ostensibly looking for his reading glasses. I followed him, noting how his eyes catalogued everything of value. The antique furniture my husband and I had collected over the years, the artwork Robert had given me for birthdays and holidays, the silver tea service that had been a wedding gift. I still don't see those glasses anywhere, he said, completing his circuit of the house. I must have left them somewhere else. As I walked him to the door, he paused and pulled a business card from his wallet. I met someone last week who specializes in estate planning. Very knowledgeable, very discreet. If you ever want to review your options, give him a call. I took the card without looking at it. Thank you. And Mom, maybe we should get together more regularly. Weekly visits, perhaps? I feel like I've missed so much of your life lately. After he left, I sat in my living room and really examined the business card he had given me. It wasn't for an estate planning attorney as he had claimed. It was for a company that specialized in buying homes quickly for cash, particularly from elderly sellers who needed to liquidate assets fast. I walked to my computer and for the first time in years began researching something that had never occurred to me before. The effects of certain herbs on elderly people, particularly those with high blood pressure. What I found made my blood run cold. The combination of herbs Henry had brought yesterday, when consumed in sufficient quantities, could indeed cause throat swelling and digestive distress in the short term. But more disturbing were the long-term effects described in several medical journals. Regular consumption could lead to gradual liver damage, kidney problems, and cardiac irregularities, all conditions that might appear to be natural age-related decline in a 60-year-old woman. More chilling still was a forum discussion I found where someone had asked about the therapeutic dosage of this exact herbal combination for an elderly relative with hypertension. The user's handle was Henry B. 1987. 1987, the year my son was born. I printed out the forum discussion with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The date stamp showed it had been posted 3 weeks ago, shortly after Robert's death had been announced in the local newspaper. 3 weeks ago, Henry had started planning my death. That evening, as I sat in my kitchen with the printed pages spread before me, I realized that yesterday's accident with Avery had revealed the true purpose of Henry's sudden interest in my health. The herbal tea hadn't been a loving son's attempt to help his stressed mother. It had been a test run. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at those printed forum pages, reading and rereading Henry's posts about therapeutic dosages and elderly relatives. Each time I hoped I was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation for my son researching the effects of herbs that could slowly damage an older person's organs. But there was no mistaking the cold, clinical tone of his questions, or the way he had asked about masking the bitter taste to make the mixture more palatable. On Friday morning, I made a decision that would change everything between us forever. Instead of waiting for Henry to make his next move, I would confront him directly. I needed to look into his eyes and hear from his own mouth what he was planning to do to me. I called him at work, something I never did. His cheerful greeting when he answered made my stomach turn. "Mom, what a nice surprise. Is everything okay?" "Henry, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come by this evening?" There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of concern that would have seemed genuine if I hadn't known better. "Of course. Is this about your health? Have you been feeling worse?" "We'll discuss it when you get here. Come alone." "What about Avery? She's been wanting to check on you since her reaction to that tea." "Alone, Henry." After I hung up, I spent the day preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I printed out additional copies of his forum posts, including ones where he had asked about the cumulative effects of regular consumption, and whether the symptoms would be distinguishable from natural aging processes. The cold calculation in his words made me feel sick. Henry arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same forced smile that had become his trademark during these visits. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man who believed his plan was proceeding smoothly. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said, following me into the living room. "I brought your favorite Pinot Grigio. Maybe we can talk over a glass of wine." "I don't think wine is appropriate for this conversation." Something in my tone made him pause. For the first time since his visits had started, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. I sat down across from him and placed the printed pages on the coffee table between us. "I found something interesting online yesterday." Henry's eyes fell on the papers, and I watched his face carefully. The moment he recognized his own posts, his entire demeanor changed. The fake warmth disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that I had never seen in my son before. "You went through my browsing history?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I didn't need to. You posted these questions in public forums using your birth year as part of your username. Not very clever for someone planning what you're planning." Henry leaned back in his chair, and for several long moments we stared at each other in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different from the concerned son act he had been performing. "So you know. I know that you've been researching ways to slowly harm elderly people using herbal preparations. I know that you brought me a tea blend specifically designed to cause organ damage over time. I know that when Avery accidentally drank it instead of me, you watched her suffer to see how effective it would be." Henry picked up one of the printed pages and scanned it casually, as if we were discussing a recipe rather than attempted murder. "You make it sound so sinister. I was researching natural health remedies for age-related conditions." "Don't lie to me anymore, Henry. I've read every post. You asked specifically about making symptoms appear natural, about dosages that would cause gradual decline, about masking bitter tastes. You even asked whether anyone would be suspicious if an elderly person died of apparent heart failure after months of declining health." "And what did you conclude from your detective work?" he asked, setting the paper down with deliberate calm. "I concluded that my son has been planning to kill me for my inheritance." The words hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Henry didn't deny them. Instead, he stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the garden where I had spent so many peaceful hours over the years. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be drowning financially while your mother sits on $750,000 in assets?" he asked without turning around. The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't even pretending anymore. "Henry, if you needed money, you could have asked me. We could have worked something out." He turned around, and the expression on his face was one of pure contempt. Asked you? And listened to lectures about fiscal responsibility and living within our means? I've heard those speeches my entire adult life. So you decided to kill me instead? I decided to help nature take its course a little faster than it might otherwise. You're 60 years old, Mom. You've lived a full life. Avery and I are still young, still building our future. We have debts, dreams, plans that require capital. The coldness in his voice was more frightening than anger would have been. This wasn't a moment of desperate passion or temporary insanity. This was calculated, rational planning by someone who had weighed my life against his financial needs and found me wanting. How long have you been giving me those herbs? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. This was actually the first attempt. I needed to test the mixture first, make sure it would work the way I intended. Avery's reaction was quite informative, though she experienced it much more intensely than you would have. The dosage was calibrated for someone your age and weight. I felt nauseated. He was discussing my planned murder with the same detachment he might use to describe a business transaction. And if I hadn't given it to Avery, if I had drunk it myself, you would have felt mildly unwell for a day or two. Nothing more dramatic than that. But your liver and kidneys would have begun processing toxins they weren't designed to handle. Over the course of several months, with regular doses, your organs would have shown signs of stress. You would have started feeling more tired, perhaps experienced some digestive issues, maybe some heart palpitations. And eventually, you would have had what appeared to be a natural heart attack or stroke. Very sad, but not unexpected for someone your age dealing with the stress of recent bereavement and financial decisions. And the clinical precision of his plan was horrifying. He had thought through every detail, anticipated every contingency. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated murder disguised as natural causes. What about Avery? Is she part of this? For the first time, Henry hesitated. Avery is complicated. She knows about our financial situation, obviously. She knows we need a solution. But she's squeamish about the details. Squeamish about murdering your mother, you mean? She prefers not to think about the methodology. She just wants the problem to go away. I thought about Avery's behavior during their visits, her obvious distress, the way she had avoided eye contact. She might not have been an active participant, but she was certainly complicit in whatever Henry had planned for me. So what happens now? I asked. Now that I know what you're planning? Henry sat back down, and I saw him considering his options. The mask was completely off now, revealing a stranger I barely recognized. Now we need to have a practical discussion about your estate planning, he said finally. Because one way or another, Avery and I are going to inherit your assets. The only question is whether you want to cooperate and make the transition smooth, or whether you want to make this difficult for everyone involved. You're threatening me. I'm presenting you with options. You can update your will to leave everything to us, then perhaps take a nice long trip somewhere. Lake Tahoe, maybe. Uncle Robert's property is quite isolated. Anything could happen to someone traveling alone at your age. The implications of his words made my blood run cold. He wasn't just planning to poison me slowly. He was prepared to arrange a more immediate solution if necessary. And if I refuse? Henry's smile was the most chilling thing I had ever seen. Then we go back to the original plan. You've already been exposed to the herbal preparation once when Avery spilled that tea. There are traces of it in your system now. If you were to have another accident, perhaps slip and fall, hit your head, the autopsy would show elevated levels of certain compounds that could have contributed to dizziness or disorientation. Very tragic, but explainable. I realized with crystal clarity that my son was a sociopath. The Henry that I thought I knew, the boy I had raised and loved despite our difficulties, had either never existed or had been consumed by greed and selfishness so complete that he could calmly discuss murdering his own mother. "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm practical. and I'm tired of waiting for you to die naturally while Avery and I struggle to make ends meet. You have money you don't need, sitting in accounts gathering dust while we work ourselves to death, trying to pay off credit cards and student loans. I earned that money through 40 years of careful saving and hard work. Robert left it to me because he knew I would use it responsibly. And what's responsible about hoarding wealth while your own son suffers financially? You live alone in a house worth $400,000. You have more money in the bank than most people see in a lifetime. Meanwhile, Avery and I are drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, unable to even think about having children because we can't afford them. The self-pity in his voice was almost as disgusting as the calculated cruelty. He genuinely believed that he was the victim in this situation. So you decided I don't deserve to live? I decided that your death would serve a greater purpose than your continued existence. You've already lived most of your life. We're just getting started with ours. I looked at this stranger wearing my son's face and felt something inside me break completely. The last thread of maternal love, the final hope that somehow we could repair our relationship, snapped under the weight of his words. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. "I'm afraid that's not how this works anymore, Mom. We're past the point where you can just dismiss me and pretend this conversation never happened. You know too much now, and I know that you know. That changes the timeline considerably." "What do you mean?" Henry reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. "I brought a backup plan tonight, just in case our conversation didn't go the way I hoped. This is a concentrated version of the herbal preparation, dissolved in a tasteless solution that can be added to any beverage." My heart started racing as I realized what he was suggesting. "You're going to force me to drink that?" "I'm going to give you one last chance to cooperate. Sign over power of attorney to me tonight, and you can spend your remaining time in a nice care facility where you'll be comfortable and well looked after. Refuse, and I'll add this to your coffee, and by morning you'll be experiencing symptoms severe enough to require hospitalization." "You would really do this? To your own mother? To secure my future and Avery's future? Absolutely." I stared at the vial in his hand, understanding that I was facing a life or death decision. My son, the child I had carried and birthed and loved despite all our problems, was prepared to murder me for money. But he had made one crucial mistake in his planning. He had underestimated the woman who had raised him, who had survived his father's death and 20 years of struggling to make ends meet as a single mother. He thought of me as a weak, elderly victim who would simply submit to his threats. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The transformation of my son from loving family member to calculating captor happened so gradually that I almost missed it. After our confrontation that Friday evening, Henry didn't leave as I had demanded. Instead, he made himself comfortable in my living room and began making phone calls. "Avery, honey, I'm going to stay at Mom's tonight," he said into his phone, his voice carrying the same false warmth he had used with me for weeks. "She's had a bit of an episode, and I think she needs supervision." An episode. As if my discovery of his murder plot was a sign of mental decline rather than justified horror at my son's intentions. After he hung up, Henry turned to me with that chilling smile that had become his trademark. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting me to leave. Unfortunately, that's not really an option anymore. You see, now that you know about my research and my plans, I can't risk you doing something impulsive like calling the police or changing your will out of spite. This is my house, Henry. You can't just decide to move in." "Actually, I can, and I'm not moving in permanently, just until we get your affairs sorted out properly. Think of it as a temporary arrangement while we transition your estate planning to something more appropriate for someone in your condition." "What condition? There's nothing wrong with me." "Isn't there?" He pulled out his phone and showed me a note-taking app. "Let's see. Today, you accused your loving son of trying to poison you based on some internet posts you misunderstood. You became agitated and paranoid, making wild accusations about murder plots. You refused to listen to reason and demanded that I leave your house despite your obvious need for care and supervision. I felt cold dread creeping up my spine as I realized what he was doing. You're creating a record. I'm documenting your declining mental state. Very sad, really. The stress of Uncle Robert's death has clearly been harder on you than any of us realized. It's not uncommon for people your age to develop paranoid delusions, especially after a significant loss. No one will believe that. I'm perfectly lucid. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a confused elderly woman who's been living alone too long and has started imagining threats that don't exist. Henry stood up and walked to my front door, turning the deadbolt with a decisive click. Then he moved to the back door and repeated the process. I watched in growing horror as he secured every possible exit from my own home. What are you doing? Making sure you don't hurt yourself. People with paranoid delusions sometimes make poor decisions, like wandering outside at night or trying to contact authorities about imaginary crimes. It's really for your own safety. I reached for my phone, but Henry was faster. His hand closed over mine with a grip that was firm enough to be painful, but not quite hard enough to leave bruises. I don't think you need that right now, he said, gently but firmly removing my cell phone from my grasp. Too much stimulation can make episodes worse. Henry, this is kidnapping. You can't hold me prisoner in my own house. I'm not holding you prisoner, Mom. I'm providing care for a family member who's experiencing a mental health crisis. Big difference, legally speaking. The casual way he discussed the legal implications told me that he had researched this aspect of his plan as thoroughly as he had researched the herbal preparations. This wasn't a spontaneous decision born of panic after our confrontation. This was another calculated move in a strategy he had been developing for weeks. Now, he continued, settling back into my late husband's favorite chair, let's talk about next steps. I've made an appointment for you to see a geriatric psychiatrist on Monday morning. Dr. Brennan comes highly recommended for dealing with age-related cognitive decline. I'm not going to see any psychiatrist. Of course you are. You'll go willingly because you want to get better, and Dr. Brennan will evaluate your condition and make recommendations about the level of care you need. I suspect he'll find that living alone is no longer safe for someone in your condition. I felt trapped in a nightmare where my own words and actions were being twisted into evidence of mental illness. And what happens after this appointment? That depends on you. If you're cooperative, if you acknowledge that you need help and support, then we can arrange for appropriate care. Perhaps a nice assisted living facility where you can be monitored and given the medications you need. Medications? Dr. Brennan will almost certainly prescribe something to help with your anxiety and paranoid thoughts. Antipsychotic medications can be very effective for people experiencing the kind of delusions you've been having. The picture he was painting became clearer with every word. Once I was medicated and institutionalized, it would be easy for Henry to gain control of my finances and property. Any protests I made about his true intentions would be dismissed as further evidence of my mental instability. And if I'm not cooperative? Henry's expression hardened slightly. Then we implement more immediate solutions. You've already been exposed to herbal preparations that could cause confusion and disorientation. If you were to have an accident while in a compromised mental state, well, that would be a tragedy, but not entirely unexpected. I realized that I was completely at his mercy. He controlled access to my phone, my car keys, even my ability to leave the house. He had created a narrative that painted me as mentally unstable, and any resistance I offered would be interpreted as further proof of my condition. I need to use the bathroom, I said, hoping to buy myself some time to think. Of course, but I think it's best if you leave the door open. People with your condition sometimes have falls in enclosed spaces. The humiliation of having my privacy stripped away was almost as devastating as the fear. I walked to my bathroom with as much dignity as I could muster, acutely aware that Henry was watching my every move. In the bathroom mirror, I looked at myself carefully. I didn't look like a confused elderly woman. My eyes were clear, my posture straight, my expression alert. But I knew that appearance wouldn't matter if Henry succeeded in getting me evaluated by a doctor who was expecting to see signs of dementia or paranoid delusion. When I returned to the living room, I found Henry going through my desk drawers with systematic efficiency. "What are you looking for?" "Important documents, insurance papers, bank statements, your will. It's important that I understand your complete financial picture so I can help manage your affairs properly. Those documents are private." "Not anymore. As your primary caregiver, I need access to all relevant information about your health and finances." He pulled out my current will, a document I had updated just 6 months earlier after Robert's death. I watched him read through it, noting the way his jaw tightened when he reached certain sections. "This is very generous to various charities," he said without looking up, "almost as if you care more about strangers than your own family." "I believe in supporting causes that matter to me." "Well, we'll need to revisit these allocations. Someone in your condition shouldn't be making major financial decisions without proper guidance." He found my bank statements next, and I saw his eyes light up when he confirmed the balance in my savings account. $350,000, just as he had expected, plus the smaller amounts in my checking and money market accounts. "Very impressive nest egg," he said. "Far more than any single person needs for their remaining years. That money represents a lifetime of careful saving. And now it represents security for the next generation of our family. Uncle Robert would want his inheritance to benefit his nephew and nephew's wife, don't you think?" The way he twisted Robert's memory made me sick. My brother had left me that money because he trusted me to use it wisely, not because he wanted to fund Henry's lifestyle. Henry continued going through my papers with the thoroughness of an accountant conducting an audit. He found my investment statements, my insurance policies, the deed to the Lake Tahoe property Robert had left me. Each discovery seemed to please him more than the last. "You really are quite wealthy," he said when he had finished his inventory. "Much more so than I had realized. This changes some of my calculations." "What calculations?" "How long this process needs to take. With assets of this magnitude, it's worth investing a bit more time in making sure everything is handled properly. We don't want to rush into anything that might raise unnecessary questions." I understood that he was revising his timeline. The larger the inheritance, the more careful he needed to be about acquiring it legally. "I'm hungry," I said, realizing that we had been talking for hours and I hadn't eaten since lunch. "Of course. Let me make you something." Henry stood up and walked toward my kitchen, and I started to follow him. "Actually, why don't you rest in your chair? I can handle dinner. You seem tired, and stress can be very hard on people your age." I wanted to protest, but I realized that following him would accomplish nothing except confirming his narrative about my need for supervision. Instead, I sat down and listened to him moving around in my kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers with the familiarity of someone who had been studying the layout. When he returned 20 minutes later, he carried a tray with a bowl of soup and a cup of tea. Both looked perfectly normal, but I found myself staring at them with suspicion. "It's just chicken soup from a can," Henry said, noticing my hesitation. "And chamomile tea from the box you keep in your pantry. Nothing exotic or unusual." "I'm not really hungry right now." "You need to eat, Mom. Proper nutrition is especially important for people dealing with the kind of stress you've been under." I took a small spoonful of soup and found that it tasted exactly as it should. The tea also seemed normal, with the mild, familiar flavor of chamomile and honey. But I couldn't shake the feeling that accepting anything from Henry was dangerous. "There," he said when I had managed to eat about half the soup. "Don't you feel better now?" Actually, I did feel different, but not in a way that made me feel better. I felt drowsy, relaxed in a way that didn't seem natural given the circumstances. My thoughts seemed to move more slowly, and my anxiety about the situation began to fade into a kind of foggy acceptance. "I think I'm tired," I said, surprised at how slurred my words sounded. Of course you are. It's been a very stressful day. Why don't you go to bed early tonight? Things will look clearer in the morning. I stood up, intending to walk to my bedroom, but my legs felt unsteady. Henry immediately moved to support my elbow, his grip firm and controlling. Careful there, he said with false concern. These episodes can really take it out of you. As he helped me to my bedroom, I realized that he had indeed added something to my food. Not the dangerous herbal preparation he had threatened me with earlier, but something milder, designed to make me compliant and confused rather than seriously ill. Sleep well, Mom, he said, helping me sit on the edge of my bed. Tomorrow we'll start making some positive changes in your life. After he left my room, I heard him moving around the house, checking locks, closing curtains, making himself completely at home. I lay in my bed, feeling drugged and helpless, and understood that this was only the beginning. Henry had turned my own home into a prison, and I was now completely under his control. I woke up Saturday morning with a clarity that surprised me, considering how foggy I had felt the night before. Whatever Henry had given me to make me compliant was wearing off, and with that clarity came a cold, calculated anger, unlike anything I had ever experienced. My son had made several crucial mistakes in his planning, and as I lay in bed listening to him move around my kitchen, I began to formulate a plan of my own. Henry thought he was dealing with a helpless elderly woman who would submit to his control out of fear and confusion. But he had forgotten something important about the woman who had raised him as a single mother for nearly 20 years. I was a survivor. When Henry knocked on my bedroom door at 8 o'clock, I was ready for him. Good morning, Mom. How are you feeling today? I made my voice slightly uncertain, with just a hint of the confusion he expected to hear. I'm not sure. Yesterday feels a bit fuzzy. Did we have an argument? The satisfaction that flickered across his face told me my performance was convincing. You had a bit of an episode, nothing too serious, but enough to make me concerned about you living alone. Do you remember any of it? I pretended to struggle with my memory. Bits and pieces. Something about Uncle Robert's will? I remember being upset about something. You were confused about some papers you found online. You thought they meant something they didn't. It's not uncommon for people your age to misinterpret things when they're under stress. Oh. I let my voice carry a note of embarrassment. I hope I didn't say anything too foolish. Nothing that can't be forgotten. The important thing is that we're going to get you some help. I've made an appointment with a doctor who specializes in age-related memory issues. I nodded as if this seemed reasonable. That's probably a good idea. I have been feeling more forgetful lately. Henry's relief was visible. He had expected resistance, argument, perhaps even attempts to contact the authorities. Instead, he was getting compliance from a woman who seemed appropriately concerned about her declining mental state. I'll make you some breakfast, he offered. You need to keep your strength up for the appointment on Monday. That's very kind of you, dear. You know, I was thinking about what you said yesterday about Uncle Robert's inheritance. Maybe you're right that it's too much for one person to manage alone. Henry paused in the doorway, clearly pleased by this development. I'm glad you're starting to see the practical side of the situation. Managing significant assets requires expertise and energy that becomes more challenging as we age. Exactly. And I've been thinking about the Lake Tahoe property as well. I haven't even visited it since Robert left it to me. It seems wasteful to let it sit empty when it could be put to better use. That's very mature thinking, Mom. The property market in that area is quite strong right now. It might be wise to sell while values are high. I nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps we could drive up there this weekend and take a look at it together? I'd value your opinion about what should be done with it. The suggestion clearly appealed to Henry for reasons that had nothing to do with real estate evaluation. An isolated property, hours away from any neighbors, would be the perfect place to arrange an accident for an elderly woman with newly documented mental health issues. That's an excellent idea, he said, Fresh mountain air might be good for your overall health as well. After Henry left to prepare breakfast, I moved quickly and quietly. I had perhaps 10 minutes while he was occupied in the kitchen, and I needed to use that time effectively. First, I retrieved my spare cell phone from its hiding place in my bedroom closet. It was an old phone I kept for emergencies, and Henry didn't know it existed. I powered it on and quickly typed a text message to my neighbor Margaret, who lived 3 houses down and had been a friend for over 15 years. "Margaret, this is Courtney. I need your help. Henry is at my house and I'm in danger. Please don't call or come over. But if you don't hear from me by Sunday evening, call the police and tell them to check the Lake Tahoe property that belonged to my brother Robert. The address is 427 Pine Ridge Road." I sent the message and immediately powered down the phone, hiding it back in my closet just as I heard Henry's footsteps returning down the hallway. "Breakfast is ready," he announced cheerfully. "I made your favorite scrambled eggs with toast." I joined him in the kitchen, noting that he had already prepared my plate and poured my coffee. The eggs looked perfectly normal, but I had learned not to trust anything Henry gave me to consume. "This looks wonderful," I said, taking a small bite. The eggs tasted fine, but I made sure to eat slowly and leave most of the food untouched. "You're not very hungry this morning," Henry observed. "I think the stress has affected my appetite, but the coffee is perfect." I took several sips of coffee, noting that it also tasted normal. Either Henry was saving his chemical interventions for when he really needed them, or he was confident enough in his control that he didn't feel the need to drug me again. As we sat at my kitchen table, I studied my son's face carefully. The mask of concern was back in place, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was already planning the trip to Lake Tahoe, thinking through the logistics of making my death appear accidental. "When would you like to drive up to the property?" I asked. "Today or tomorrow?" "Today might be better. The weather forecast shows rain tomorrow, which could make the mountain roads more dangerous." Dangerous. The word choice was deliberate, part of his narrative about the hazards facing elderly people who took unnecessary risks. "That sounds perfect. Should I pack an overnight bag? We could stay at the cabin and make a real vacation of it." Henry's eyes lit up. An overnight trip would give him even more opportunities to arrange an accident away from any potential witnesses. "I think that's a wonderful idea. The mountain air and change of scenery will be good for your mental state. I'll pack some of Uncle Robert's herbal tea collection. He left quite an extensive selection in the cabin, and I know you've developed an interest in natural remedies." For just a moment, Henry's confident expression faltered. The mention of herbal teas clearly made him uncomfortable, perhaps because it reminded him of how easily his original plan had been disrupted when Avery drank the mixture intended for me. "That's thoughtful," he said carefully. "But I think it's best if you avoid any unusual herbal preparations right now. Your system needs time to stabilize." "Of course, you're absolutely right. I'll stick to regular tea and coffee." As I spoke, I was already planning how to turn Henry's own methods against him. Robert had indeed left an extensive collection of medicinal herbs at the Lake Tahoe property, and unlike Henry's crude internet research, I had actually studied botanical medicine during my years as a young woman interested in natural healing. I knew which herbs could cause digestive distress without serious harm. I knew how to prepare tinctures that would induce temporary disorientation and weakness. Most importantly, I knew how to mask bitter tastes in ways that would make even suspicious people drink willingly. While Henry packed his overnight bag, I prepared my own supplies. Hidden among my usual toiletries and clothing, I included several small vials of concentrated herbal extracts that I had prepared years ago and kept for emergency situations. I also packed Robert's journal, which contained detailed notes about the medicinal plants growing wild around the Lake Tahoe property. My brother had been even more knowledgeable about botanical medicine than I was, and his journal was like having a pharmacist's reference guide for the local flora. "Are you ready to go?" Henry asked, appearing in my bedroom doorway with his bag and car keys. "Almost. I just want to make sure I have everything I might need." As I zipped up my overnight bag, I felt a calm determination settle over me. Henry thought he was taking me to an isolated location where he could kill me without witnesses or interference. What he didn't realize was that he was walking into a trap of my own design. The drive to Lake Tahoe took just over 2 hours, during which Henry kept up a steady stream of conversation designed to reinforce his narrative about my declining mental state. "Do you remember the last time you visited Uncle Robert's property?" he asked, as we wound through the mountain roads. "Not clearly. Everything from the past few months feels a bit hazy." "That's understandable. Grief and stress can really affect memory and cognitive function in people your age." People your age. He kept using that phrase, as if 60 years old meant I was 1 foot in the grave and incapable of independent thought or action. "I hope spending some time in Robert's space will help me feel more connected to his memory," I said. "I'm sure it will. And it will give us a chance to evaluate the property objectively and make some practical decisions about its future." When we arrived at the cabin, I felt a wave of emotion that had nothing to do with my current situation. Robert had loved this place, and it showed in every carefully maintained detail. The log cabin sat on a bluff overlooking the lake, surrounded by towering pine trees and wild herb gardens that he had cultivated over decades. "It's beautiful," Henry said, but I could hear the calculation in his voice as he evaluated the property's worth. "Robert spent 40 years making it perfect," I replied. "He always said this was the one place in the world where he felt truly at peace." We unloaded our bags and settled into the cabin. Henry immediately began exploring, ostensibly appreciating the rustic charm but actually checking sight lines, evaluating potential accident scenarios, and confirming the isolation that would make his plans easier to execute. "The nearest neighbor is over a mile away," he observed. "Very private." Yes, Robert valued his solitude. That evening, I cooked dinner using ingredients we had brought from town, making sure to prepare everything where Henry could watch me. I needed him to feel confident that I wasn't suspicious of his motives or planning any resistance to whatever he intended to do. After dinner, as the sun set over the lake, I suggested we have tea on the deck. "What a wonderful idea," Henry agreed. "Let me prepare it for you. You should relax and enjoy the view." Actually, I'd like to do it myself. It would make me feel closer to Robert, using his kitchen and his tea collection. Henry hesitated, clearly preferring to control what I consumed, but unable to refuse without seeming suspicious. "Of course, I'll just enjoy this beautiful sunset." In Robert's kitchen, I prepared 2 cups of tea with meticulous care. Henry's cup received a carefully measured dose of herbs that would cause severe digestive distress and temporary disorientation without leaving lasting harm. My own cup contained nothing but chamomile and honey. I knew the effects would begin within 30 minutes of consumption, and I planned to be far away from the cabin when Henry realized what was happening to him. "Here you go," I said, handing him the steaming cup as we sat together on the deck. This blend was one of Robert's favorites. He always said it helped him sleep peacefully. Henry accepted the tea without suspicion, trusting that his elderly, confused mother wouldn't be capable of turning his own methods against him. "It smells wonderful," he said, taking a large sip. "Very soothing." I watched him drink, feeling no guilt whatsoever about what I was doing. Henry had planned to murder me for money, had held me prisoner in my own home, and had brought me to this isolated location specifically to arrange my death. Whatever discomfort he was about to experience was nothing compared to what he had planned for me. "I think I'll take a walk down to the lake," I said after he had finished most of his tea. "The evening air is so refreshing." "That's a good idea. Gentle exercise is excellent for your overall health." I walked slowly toward the lake, counting the minutes in my head. By the time Henry realized what was happening to him, I would be safely hidden in the woods surrounding the cabin, with my spare cell phone ready to call for help if necessary. 25 minutes after he finished his tea, I heard the first sounds of distress from the cabin. Henry was calling my name, his voice strained and panicky. By the time he managed to stumble out onto the deck looking for me, I was concealed in a grove of trees with a clear view of his suffering. Watching my son experience the fear and helplessness he had planned for me should have brought satisfaction. Instead, I felt only a profound sadness for the boy I had raised and loved, who had grown into a man capable of such calculated cruelty. But I also felt something else that surprised me. Freedom. For the first time in months, I was in complete control of my own fate. I watched from my hiding place among the pine trees as Henry stumbled around the cabin deck, calling my name with increasing desperation. The herbs were working exactly as I had intended. He was experiencing severe nausea, disorientation, and weakness, but nothing that would cause permanent harm. Unlike what he had planned for me. After an hour of watching him suffer, I emerged from the woods and approached the cabin as if I had simply returned from a pleasant evening walk. "Henry, what's wrong?" I called out, injecting just the right note of confused concern into my voice. He was sitting on the deck steps, his head in his hands, looking pale and shaken. When he looked up at me, his eyes were unfocused and there was genuine fear in his expression. "Mom, something's wrong. I feel terrible. Dizzy, nauseous, like I might pass out." "Oh my goodness. What could have caused that? Should we drive to the hospital?" "I don't think I can drive. Everything is spinning, and my stomach." He doubled over again, confirming that the herbs were affecting him exactly as I had calculated. "Well, we can't stay here if you're seriously ill. Let me think." I paused, as if considering our options. "You know, Uncle Robert always said that certain combinations of his herbs could cause reactions in people who weren't used to them. Did you drink that tea I made?" Henry's eyes widened as the implications hit him. "The tea? You think the tea did this?" "It's possible. Robert's blends were quite potent, and he always warned me to be careful about dosages." I sat down beside him, putting on my most concerned mother expression. "I'm so sorry, dear. I should have thought about that before offering it to you." "How long will this last?" His voice was weak, almost childlike in its vulnerability. "I'm not sure. Robert never told me much about the specific effects or duration. But I think the best thing is for you to rest and let it work through your system naturally." As I spoke, I was calculating my next moves. Henry was incapacitated for at least several more hours, which gave me time to implement the rest of my plan. I helped him inside and settled him on the couch, bringing him water and acting like the caring mother he had been manipulating. "Try to sleep," I told him. "I'll keep an eye on you and make sure you're okay." Once Henry had dozed off, fitful and uncomfortable, but no longer able to focus on anything except his own misery, I began working. First, I used my spare phone to send another message to Margaret. "I'm safe for now. Henry became ill after drinking some of Uncle Robert's herbal tea. We'll keep you updated. If anything happens to me, make sure the police know that Henry has been planning to harm me for my inheritance." Then I began searching through Henry's belongings. His phone contained a wealth of evidence that I photographed with my spare device. Text messages to Avery discussing their financial desperation and speculating about when I might die naturally. Search histories full of queries about herbal substances and their effects on elderly people. Even draft emails to estate attorneys asking about expediting inheritance proceedings. Most damning of all was a voice recording he had made on his phone the previous evening, apparently intended as a personal log of his plans. "Day 2 of the intervention," his voice said clearly through the phone speaker. "Mom is showing expected signs of compliance after last night's mild sedative. The paranoid episode seems to have convinced her that she needs help, which will make the psychiatric evaluation much easier. If Dr. Brennan cooperates as expected, we should have legal control of her assets within 2 weeks. The Lake Tahoe trip will provide the perfect opportunity for a more permanent solution if the legal route proves too slow or complicated." A permanent solution. My own son casually discussing my murder as if it were a business decision. I saved copies of everything to my spare phone and then composed a detailed email to the local police, explaining Henry's plans and providing all the evidence I had gathered. I scheduled the email to be sent automatically if I didn't cancel it within 12 hours, ensuring that even if something happened to me, the truth would still come out. When Henry woke up the next morning, he was feeling better physically but clearly shaken by what he had experienced. "How are you feeling?" I asked, bringing him coffee and toast. "Much better, thank you. That was terrifying. I've never felt so helpless." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me, but I simply nodded sympathetically. "I'm just glad you're okay. I was worried I might have accidentally caused serious harm." No lasting damage, I think. But it certainly gave me a new perspective on how dangerous these natural remedies can be if you don't know what you're doing. Yes, knowledge is so important when dealing with substances that can affect people's health and well-being. Henry looked at me sharply, as if something in my tone had alerted him to a deeper meaning in my words. "I think we should head home today," he said. "This trip didn't go quite as I had planned." "Of course, but first, I want to show you something." I led him to Robert's study, where my brother had kept his most important papers. I pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Henry. "Uncle Robert's will and estate documents. I thought you might be interested in seeing how he structured his inheritance to me." Henry opened the folder eagerly, scanning the legal language for details about the money and property I had received. As he read, his expression grew increasingly confused. "I don't understand," he said finally. "This says the inheritance is structured as a trust, with specific conditions for distribution." "That's right. Very specific conditions." "What conditions?" I smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction as I delivered the words I had been planning since the moment Henry revealed his true intentions. "The trust stipulates that if I die within 5 years of receiving the inheritance, or if there are any suspicious circumstances surrounding my death, the entire amount reverts to Robert's designated charities. Nothing goes to my heirs." Henry stared at me, the implications slowly sinking in. "But that would mean that killing me would gain you absolutely nothing. In fact, it would ensure that you never receive a penny of Uncle Robert's money." I watched the color drain from his face as he realized that his elaborate plan had been doomed from the beginning. "Furthermore," I continued, "Robert included a specific clause about attempts to coerce or harm me in order to access the inheritance. Any evidence of such attempts automatically triggers the reversion to charity, regardless of whether I live or die." "You knew," he whispered. "You've known all along." "I've known since yesterday morning, when I found your internet posts and realized what you were planning. The trust documents were in my safe deposit box, and I reviewed them before agreeing to this trip." Henry sank into Robert's desk chair, his grand plan crumbling around him. "So everything I've done has been pointless, worse than pointless. You've created a detailed record of attempted elder abuse and planned murder, all for an inheritance you could never have accessed through violence." I pulled out my spare phone and showed him the evidence I had gathered. "I have recordings, photographs, text messages, and your own voice memo describing your plans for a permanent solution to your financial problems. What are you going to do with that?" "That depends entirely on you." I sat down across from him, looking into the face of the stranger my son had become. "You have 2 choices, Henry. You can disappear from my life completely and permanently, or you can face the legal consequences of what you've attempted to do." "What do you mean, disappear?" "I mean you pack your things, you leave my house, and you never contact me again. No phone calls, no visits, no attempts to reconcile. You accept that you are no longer my son, and I am no longer your mother. And if I choose the legal route, then I turn over all this evidence to the police, along with testimony from your wife about your financial desperation and planning sessions. You'll face charges for attempted poisoning, elder abuse, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder." Henry was quiet for several long minutes, processing his options. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You planned this perfectly. I learned from an expert. You taught me a great deal about manipulation and long-term planning over the past few weeks." And there's really no way for me to inherit anything from you? None whatsoever. Robert made sure of that. He saw something in you years ago that I was too blind to recognize. That's why he structured the trust the way he did. Uncle Robert never liked me. Uncle Robert saw through you. He knew that if something happened to me, you would be the most likely suspect. So he made it financially pointless for you to harm me. Henry stood up slowly, moving like a man who had aged decades in the space of a single conversation. What about Avery? What about her? Will you tell her what I planned? That's between you and your conscience. But I will say this. She deserves to know who she married before she wastes any more of her life with you. We drove back to Sacramento in complete silence. When we arrived at my house, Henry collected his belongings without a word and loaded them into his car. As he prepared to leave, he turned back to me one final time. I really needed that money, Mom. Avery and I are drowning in debt, and I couldn't see any other solution. You could have asked for help. You could have talked to me honestly about your problems. Instead, you chose to see me as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a mother who might have been willing to support you. Would you have helped? Really? I considered the question seriously. Before all this? Probably. I would have found a way to assist you without compromising my own security. But now? After learning what you're truly capable of? No, Henry. I would never trust you with $1, much less my life savings. He nodded, accepting the finality of what had been lost between us. I'm sorry. I'm sure you are. But some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. I watched him drive away, and for the first time in months, I felt truly safe in my own home. 3 weeks later, I received divorce papers in the mail addressed to Henry at my house. Avery had apparently learned about his plans, either from him or through her own investigation, and had made the same choice I had made. She would rather be financially struggling and safe than married to someone capable of murder for money. I moved to the Lake Tahoe property permanently, finding peace in Robert's carefully cultivated sanctuary. The inheritance money allowed me to live comfortably while supporting causes I believed in, exactly as Robert had intended. Sometimes I still think about Henry, wondering if he learned anything from our final confrontation, or if he simply moved on to another scheme with another potential victim. But mostly, I try not to think about him at all. I had spent 60 years learning the difference between family and blood relations. Family are the people who love you, support you, and want the best for you, even when it's inconvenient for them. Blood relations are just people who happen to share your genetics. Henry had proven conclusively which category he belonged in. As for me, I discovered something valuable in those dark weeks when I thought my own son was planning to kill me. I learned that I was stronger, more resourceful, and more capable of protecting myself than I had ever imagined. That knowledge was worth more than any inheritance. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.